The sky above northern Germany was gray and motionless until the contrails appeared. 10 B-17 bombers, heavy and slow, pushing through a river of cloud. To the German pilots climbing to intercept, they looked less like aircraft and more like moving fortresses of metal and arrogance. Inside those bombers, 10 men each sweating, shouting, holding formation so tight that one wrong move could tear a wing off. 16 machine guns per plane, 4 tons of bombs below their feet, and a single order echoing in every headset: stay together, don't turn, don't break. The Luftwaffe fighters closed in. Yellow-nosed Messerschmitts came slicing through the mist. Tracer fire stitched the sky, black bursts of flak tearing open the air between them. One fortress lost an engine, another was burning, but still the formation climbed straight, unbroken, indifferent to survival. From the German cockpits, it made no sense. They were supposed to scatter, to run, to fight back. But these bombers just kept coming, silent, steady, like ghosts in formation. And then came the shock. 16 guns, perfectly still. No muzzle flash. No return fire. The flying fortresses had stopped fighting back. For a few seconds, no one fired at all. Even the German leader hesitated because for the first time in the air war over Europe, the silence was louder than the guns. No one yet knew it was a trap. The 22nd of February 1944. 19,000 feet above Leipzig, the air was a frozen maze of vapor trails and fire. The formation of B-17 seconds pressed forward through the black bursts of flak, their aluminum skins flashing under the thin winter Sunday. Inside each fortress, the crews moved like parts of a single living machine, one mind, one pulse, one shared fear that the next shell would find them. The intercoms hissed with static and half-finished prayers, while oxygen masks frosted from the men's breath. Below and behind them, the German fighters regrouped for another attack run. They had seen this before, hundreds of times, fortresses crawling toward a target, chewing up the sky with machine gun fire, losing one bomber for every mile gained. But something today was different. The rear guns stayed silent. The waist gunners weren't moving. Through the gun sights of their Messerschmitts, the bombers looked alive but unarmed. Captain Otto Richter, leading the attack, called out over the radio, his voice cracking through the static. "They're not firing, maybe out of ammo. Close in and finish them." The German formation broke into pairs, diving from the sun, cannon barrels glowing red as they fired. Yet the fortresses didn't scatter. They flew straight into the storm, holding formation so perfect it looked rehearsed. Then, out of nowhere, silver streaks tore through the clouds from above the escort fighters. P-51 Mustangs, diving at full throttle, guns blazing, shredding the Luftwaffe formation before they could even react. Within seconds, the trap was complete. The defenseless fortresses hadn't stopped fighting. They had stopped pretending to fight, drawing the enemy in close enough for the killers above to strike. When the last Messerschmitt fell in flames, the sky went quiet again. The bombers kept flying, engines coughing smoke, silhouettes fading into the gray. For the men who survived that day, one truth burned deeper than any wound. Silence, when used with purpose, could be deadlier than any gun. When the last Mustang vanished into the haze, the surviving German pilots drifted in silence, circling the smoking debris that dotted the sky. They could still see the fortresses ahead, ragged, bleeding oil, missing engines, yet somehow still in formation, flying like ghosts that refused to die. In their headsets, no one spoke. There was nothing left to say. What had begun as an easy kill had turned into a massacre, and no one could explain how. Down on the ground, the reports came in confused and fragmented. Some claimed the bombers had gone mad, charging without firing. Others swore they had seen the gunners smiling through shattered glass. Intelligence officers pored over gun camera footage frame by frame, trying to understand why the American bombers had suddenly gone silent in the middle of combat. The answer came only later, pieced together from radio logs and debriefs. The silence had been intentional. Every fortress in that formation had been briefed to hold fire the moment enemy fighters closed within 1,000 yards, creating the illusion of exhaustion and surrender. It was a psychological snare, designed to bait the Luftwaffe into point-blank range, where the Mustangs could attack with devastating precision. The tactic was as reckless as it was brilliant, a gamble that only worked once because it relied on disbelief. For the men who lived through it, that day marked the end of innocence in the air war. The Germans no longer saw the B-17 as a slow, predictable target, but as a thinking adversary capable of deception. The Americans learned something too, that victory in the sky wasn't just about firepower or numbers, but about the mind's ability to weaponize fear itself. Far below, the towns burned, the factories shattered, and the echoes of that battle drifted over a continent that was learning, hour by hour, that ingenuity had replaced mercy. In the weeks that followed, fragments of the mission filtered through Allied command like whispers carried by the wind. Crews returning from Leipzig spoke of radio silence, of engines running dry, of fortresses that refused to die, even after losing half their guns. The official reports mentioned only unusual coordination between bomber and escort units. But inside the Air Force briefing rooms, senior officers knew they had witnessed something entirely new. The tactics spread quietly, shared by word of mouth between squadrons, passed from one debriefing to the next, like a secret code. Crews called it ghost formation. To the outside observer, it looked like suicide. To those inside, it was choreography, a disciplined dance between deception and precision, designed to exploit the enemy's confidence. Instructors at training bases began adding the story to their lectures, not as doctrine, but as legend, a reminder that sometimes hesitation could kill faster than bullets. German intelligence eventually learned the truth, but by then the damage was irreversible. Luftwaffe pilots no longer trusted what they saw in the air. Every quiet bomber became a question, every silent gun a threat waiting to reveal its purpose. That doubt, small, invisible, corrosive, spread through their ranks like rust. By spring, the skies over Europe had changed. The once invincible interceptors were now outnumbered, outflown, and outthought. The flying fortress, once mocked for its bulk and inefficiency, had become the symbol of something larger than firepower. It was proof that discipline, timing, and intellect could turn even silence into a weapon. Decades later, in museums across America, visitors would stand beneath the wings of restored B-17 seconds and read plaques describing their armor, their guns, their range. But none of those numbers captured the real reason they endured. It wasn't the steel, or the fire, or the bombs they carried. It was the quiet moment when they stopped fighting back and changed the war by pretending to lose. Years after the war ended, the men who survived that sky over Leipzig rarely spoke about it directly. They would mention the cold, the vibration through the fuselage, the smell of burnt oil on their clothes, but not the silence, the deliberate, chosen quiet that had saved them. For most, it was easier to talk about engines and formations than about the moment they decided to stop firing and simply keep flying. The choice had not come from courage alone. It had come from something deeper, an understanding that fear could be turned back on the one who caused it. On the other side of history, former Luftwaffe pilots gave interviews from tidy living rooms, their eyes still tracing the memory of silver wings above the clouds. Some confessed they had almost admired the fortresses that day, those slow-moving hulks that refused to break apart even under cannon fire. One pilot said he remembered lining up his guns on a bomber that did not shoot back, hesitating just long enough to realize the trap. By the time he rolled away, his wingman was gone. In quiet museums and veterans halls, the story of that mission survived in fragments, photographs, mission logs, and a few blackened pieces of aluminum recovered from a field outside Leipzig. Visitors reading the display often lingered at one sentence engraved in brass. Sometimes silence speaks louder than fire. Oh, for the airmen who lived through it, that line carried more than memory. It carried the weight of understanding. They had learned that war was not only a contest of weapons, but of nerve and imagination. Machines could be copied, strategies could be stolen, but the mind's capacity to turn fear into strength could never be replicated. And so the legend of the flying fortresses endured not as stories of machines that killed, but of men who chose when not to. Long after the last veterans were gone, the legend of the silent fortresses continued to drift through history, like contrails fading into dusk. Historians tried to measure its value in numbers: enemy aircraft destroyed, tonnage delivered, sorties survived, but none of those figures captured the true meaning of what happened in that frozen sky. The victory had not been written in gunfire or wreckage, but in restraint, in the moment when courage stopped looking like aggression and started looking like patience. Each time a new generation studied that mission, they found something different inside it. Engineers saw the precision of teamwork under pressure. Tacticians saw the brilliance of a psychological ruse. And ordinary people saw proof that even amid chaos, reason could prevail over instinct. It became less a story about airplanes and more a parable about composure, the rarest weapon of all. At memorials from Washington to Berlin, small plaques carried the same inscription beneath the silhouettes of the B-17. Their silence changed the air war. Visitors would stop to read it, unaware that the quiet they felt in that moment mirrored the stillness those crews once held above the clouds. The lesson was never about dominance or destruction. It was about endurance, and the fragile intelligence that separates bravery from desperation. When the sun sets over those preserved bombers now, their aluminum skins catch the last light and seem to glow from within, as if remembering. The wind moving through the open gun ports hums faintly, a sound that could almost be a voice. It says what history sometimes forgets, that strength is not always measured by the noise it makes, but by the silence it can hold. And somewhere beyond that silence, high above the clouds, the fortresses are still flying steady, unbroken, and utterly quiet. Beneath the legend of bravery and silence lay a story of design of engineers who built a machine that could take punishment beyond reason and still bring its crew home. The B-17 was not elegant, it was deliberate. Every rivet, every gun mount, every redundant system was a statement of intent, survival through structure. Its 4 Wright Cyclone engines could each run for hours, even when one cylinder was shot away, and its fuel lines were looped and cross-fed so a single hit wouldn't ignite the entire wing. The bomb bay doors could jam half open, the hydraulic system could fail completely, and yet the airplane could still fly, trimmed by cables and brute force. The 16 guns that defined its silhouette were arranged not for beauty but for geometry. Each position covered the blind spot of another, creating overlapping cones of fire that turned the bomber into a floating sphere of defense. When the crews stopped firing during the Leipzig run, that geometry didn't vanish, it became the illusion itself. To the approaching German fighters, the still guns looked abandoned, dead metal against the light. In truth, they were loaded, safeties off, gunners waiting for the call that never came. Even the sound of the fortress carried engineering purpose. The deep harmonic rumble of its 4 propellers masked the approach of escort fighters above, allowing the deception to mature unnoticed. Later analysis would show that the resonance between engine frequencies created a natural form of acoustic camouflage, blending the noise of dozens of bombers into a single steady hum. What kept those men alive was not chance, but the marriage between design and discipline, an aircraft built to endure, and a crew trained to trust its silence. When technology met human restraint, the result was something that transcended both, a weapon that could terrify not by fire, but by the calm that preceded it. In the aftermath of Leipzig, the idea of weaponized silence began to move quietly through the strategic corridors of the 8th Air Force. Intelligence officers filed it under a new category, psychological misdirection, a phrase that sounded clinical but meant something far more human. What the Leipzig crews had done was not luck or madness. It was the deliberate manipulation of perception, turning an enemy's expectation into their own undoing. Within months, training manuals began to include small paragraphs about controlled engagement silence, describing how visual and behavioral cues could mislead opposing pilots even before a single shot was fired. Commanders realized that warfare in the sky had entered a different dimension, one where the mind could strike faster than the gun. Pilots were instructed to study the rhythms of combat, to recognize that timing could destroy more effectively than raw firepower. Every choice of movement, when to roll, when to dive, when not to shoot, became part of a choreography designed to fracture enemy confidence. German ace reports from 1944 show a subtle shift in tone. They no longer described the fortresses as slow or clumsy, but as unpredictable, almost sentient. That change in language revealed something deeper than fear. It showed respect, born from confusion. The doctrine spread beyond bombers. Fighter groups began experimenting with feigned damage, false smoke, and radio silence to lure interceptors into kill zones. Each maneuver carried risk, yet it also carried proof that deception could buy seconds, and seconds could decide survival. By the final year of the war, the term ghost formation had entered Allied vocabulary, not as a single tactic but as a philosophy, that sometimes the most powerful message on the battlefield is the one you choose not to send. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, an art that needed no words, only nerve, discipline, and the willingness to let silence speak first. When the bombers finally crossed back over the channel, the adrenaline drained from their veins and left only the weight of exhaustion. The intercoms, once filled with clipped commands and static, went quiet except for the occasional cough or whispered count of engines still running. Smoke clung to their clothes, the bitter stench of cordite mixing with the metallic taste of fear that never fully left the throat. The men barely spoke as the airfields came into view, their minds still suspended somewhere between disbelief and grief. At Debden and Bassingbourn, the ground crews lined the runways, counting the fortresses that limped home with holes big enough to crawl through. Some landed with gear half-locked, some on their bellies, sparks trailing across wet concrete. One bomber rolled to a stop with its tail gunner still strapped in, head bowed as if asleep. Others never returned at all. Later that evening, when the mission board was updated, 3 squadrons had lost 12 aircraft, and 53 men were listed as missing. In the German records, the same mission appeared as a statistical anomaly: 22 fighters destroyed in less than 10 minutes, many without confirmed hits. The reports used words like unexpected formation behavior and loss of tactical awareness. Behind those phrases were faces, names, and fragments of stories that ended above the clouds. For the survivors on both sides, there was no triumph, only the strange emptiness that comes after surviving something too vast to comprehend. That night, as the fortresses cooled on the tarmac, their metal frames ticking and shrinking in the cold, the crews sat under the wings in silence. Some lit cigarettes, others just stared at the stars, the sky now quiet and infinite again. They didn't toast victory or speak of strategy. They just listened to the wind moving through the gun ports, carrying the memory of those who hadn't made it back. It was the kind of silence no one dared to break. Weeks later, when the official combat reports reached Allied headquarters in London, the story of the silent formation had already begun to take on a life of its own. The numbers seemed impossible. So many fortresses damaged, so many fighters destroyed, yet the facts refused to fade. Analysts replayed radio logs, plotted enemy movements, and reconstructed the mission minute by minute, until the realization emerged that what had looked like chaos was, in truth, deliberate orchestration. Commanders who had doubted the value of slow bombers found themselves reading after-action summaries with a new kind of respect. The fortresses had not just survived, they had rewritten the psychology of the air war. By spring, a commendation arrived for the 1st and 3rd bomb groups, its language unusually poetic for a military citation. It spoke of discipline under deception and courage through silence, phrases that found their way into recruitment posters and newsreels. Journalists described the mission as the day the bombers went quiet, transforming a tactical necessity into a symbol of composure and collective will. The men who flew it never corrected them. They simply nodded, aware that the truth was less cinematic and far more costly. Families back home read the names of those missing and imagined them heroes rather than ghosts, their sacrifice folded into the legend. Training academies began teaching the Leipzig engagement as a case study in psychological warfare, emphasizing that restraint could sometimes achieve what fire could not. In the mess halls and briefing rooms, new crews listened to veterans retell the event in fragments, how the silence felt like eternity, how the first Mustang appeared from the Sunday. With each retelling, the line between memory and myth blurred a little more, until the mission itself became less a story about war and more a lesson about discipline, precision, and the quiet defiance of men who refused to panic when the world around them was burning. As the years passed, the memory of that mission became more than a wartime anecdote. It evolved into a quiet philosophy whispered between generations of airmen. In classrooms where flight cadets studied the tactics of their predecessors, instructors spoke not only of the technical brilliance of the Fortress or the precision of the Mustang escorts, but of the mental discipline that had turned silence into strategy. They called it the calm edge, the ability to choose composure over instinct when everything screamed to react. That lesson reached far beyond aviation. It became a meditation on leadership, patience, and the courage to think in the middle of fear. Historians who examined the engagement decades later described it as a hinge point in human warfare, when the contest shifted from pure force to intellectual equilibrium. The idea that victory could be achieved not through noise or numbers, but through timing and understanding, reshaped how militaries viewed decision-making under pressure. Engineers learned from it, psychologists studied it, philosophers quoted it. The fortresses, once dismissed as outdated machines, had inadvertently taught the world that mastery begins not in aggression, but in restraint. For the men who survived, that truth followed them into peace. When they built careers, raised families, and tried to forget the taste of smoke, they carried with them a new definition of strength, measured not by the noise of triumph, but by the stillness that allows survival. The silence that had once filled their cockpits became, in time, a symbol of clarity, proof that control of the mind could outlast the chaos of any battlefield. And so, the legacy of the flying fortresses endured, not as relics of destruction, but as monuments to thought itself, machines that reminded humanity that even in the darkest hours, the sharpest weapon is the will to remain calm. When the narration fades and the final images dissolve into black and white photographs, what remains is not the sound of engines or the flash of gunfire, but the stillness that followed them. The flying fortresses are gone now, their wings preserved in museums, their names etched into bronze. yet the echo of what they represented still hums beneath the surface of every story told about courage. They remind us that victory is rarely about overpowering the enemy. It is about understanding the rhythm of fear, learning when to act and when to wait. Somewhere, inside every cockpit, trench, or decision we face, there exists that same thin line between panic and precision. The crews of the Leipzig mission crossed it without a word, proving that the calmest minds can command the loudest storms. Their silence was not surrender, it was mastery, the rare kind of strength that requires self-control rather than fury. For the viewer standing at the end of this story, the message is simple but impossible to forget. Bravery is not only the act of fighting back, but the choice of how to fight at all. In a world still drawn to noise and spectacle, the lesson of the fortresses whispers across time that wisdom often wears the sound of restraint, and that sometimes the most decisive moment in battle is the one where you refuse to speak first. So when you look up at a clear sky and see the faint trace of a contrail cutting through the clouds, remember that beneath those streaks once flew men who dared to stay silent in a world that demanded noise. They left behind no speeches, no monuments, only an idea that still drifts with the wind. That true power begins, not with the trigger, but with the thought that holds the finger still.